Hi, good evening, and welcome to 6 questions that business leaders have about climate change. I'm Michelle Stirling for Friends of Science Society, and tonight we're going to walk through some questions that actually I saw on Scott Adams Says in one of his pundit commentaries online one day. And I thought, now that's an interesting talk. We should address these different items. So before we begin, though, just today I received some questions from Robert Lyman. And Robert Lyman is one of our main policy contributors. He was a federal public servant for 27 years and a diplomat for 10 years. So he has a great deal of insight on the impacts of these policies because he's been assessing them most of his life. So is it appropriate for policy leaders or business corporate leaders to concede the point on human-caused climate change? Why or why not? And I guess that relates to the fact that many businesses are reluctant to speak up about it if they have questions, because they don't want to tangle with the government. They want to just go along to get along and find some pathway through the incoming regulations. But Robert suggests that it's not appropriate for public policy leaders to claim that humans are responsible for catastrophic climate change because it's not true, not the catastrophic part. It leads to irresponsible international commitments. And we see that in the way that some areas of the country are being impacted with the current efforts to reach various Paris climate targets. And he says, with respect to business, your question invites a consideration of the potential costs and benefits of climate policy, and more specifically, GHG emission reduction measures on businesses, their shareholders, and what are sometimes called their stakeholders among the public. So Robert says, I've argued that the climate changes that are likely to occur over the next century or so will not have seriously adverse effects on the Earth's population. Now, that's based on the IPCC's own analysis, and the probable increase in global income by 2100 would allow every country to adapt. So recall, there remains a lively scientific debate about the impact of any adverse effects or whether they'll occur at all. Now, of course, I know right now you're saying, wait a minute, there was a new IPCC report and it was code red for humanity. Well, that was in the press release from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and we're running up to what is called the Conference of the Party, or the 26th COP conference coming up in Glasgow. So, of course, they're hyping the climate agenda. But if you actually read the scientific report, you'll find it's far less catastrophic than the press release. So that's very important. And I'll show you some of those points later on. So Robert says that Western governments, of course, have adopted a far more pessimistic view. They're busy designing and implementing policies that will essentially force a transition from the low cost and reliable energy sources that our economy runs on to more costly and less reliable. And if you look at what's happening in the United Kingdom right now, they're in big trouble. The wind has dropped off for, I think, 35 days now. They're running out of natural gas. They often operate with an interconnect line to France and Europe, where they get some of their power from the nuclear facilities in France. There's been a fire that disabled that interconnect line. So now what's happened, ironically, is that they don't have enough carbon dioxide to process food. So there will be food shortages, there may be rolling blackouts, there will be constraints on industry, and it's turning into a domino effect of catastrophe going into winter. So that's what Robert's referring to here, things that are costlier and less reliable. So the policy instruments that governments are using notably include regulations, subsidies, and taxes. And each of these offers different risks and opportunities. Of course, we see some businesses are able to capitalize on various subsidies, like predominantly the wind and solar industries, and others like oil and gas are being taxed to death or battered by environmental groups. So regulation, in effect, substitutes governmental choices for those of consumers and businesses as to what to produce and use. And think of regulations that require increased generation of electricity by industrial wind turbines, or those that prohibit consumers from buying internal combustion vehicles. And that's a recently passed law that soon all vehicles will have to be EVs. Subsidies are intended to have the same effect by altering the underlying competitive viability of businesses or bribing customers with their own money. So in Canada, Robert says he's counted 23 different ways in which renewable energy is subsidized or given other market advantages over conventional fuels. And some businesses see the best response to a subsidy-centered policy as just, getting added to that list of recipients. But, what does that do down the line? Like, that may be an interim measure, but think about the long-term consequences of that. That's what we see in the UK right now. So then he goes on to say taxation is often used as an alternative way to change the costs and prices of energy services in the marketplace. And businesses often welcome the concept of carbon dioxide taxes as, in theory, it's maybe a more benign and less intrusive approach by the state, assuming, of course, that governments do substitute carbon taxes for regulations and subsidies and not just pile on. So what usually happens, unfortunately, is that taxes are simply added to regulations and subsidies, thereby undoing whatever theoretical advantages they might have. And meanwhile, carbon taxes can have seriously adverse effects on the international competitive viability of emissions-intensive firms. And you'll see that later in this presentation. You'll see a map of the world, and you'll note that the global average price of carbon is $8 a ton. And our carbon tax is $40 a ton. So that's problematic. So far, businesses in Western countries seem to have viewed catastrophic premised climate policies as insuperable and have rarely, if ever, challenged either the underlying scientific and modeling premises or the design of mitigation policies. Robert Lyman says, I view this as largely self-destructive, at least insofar as the businesses hope to maintain high levels of activity in Western countries. The net effect of most current climate policies in Western countries is to encourage the transfer of income and wealth from those countries to the ones that do not follow such policies, largely in Asia. And again, a prime example of this is the United Kingdom. A lot of their heavy industry, when all of these climate policies were introduced, which was much earlier than us. It was about 2010, I think, they started incorporating very stringent policies. Most of their heavy industry just moved offshore to where? China, to Korea, South Korea, to India. Now, environmentally policies are very loose there compared to the UK. And so the UK could brag and say, well, look at us, we reduced our emissions, but at what cost? Job loss. And now they find themselves in a real pickle. So Robert Lyman offered another question. Is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, currently about science? Or perhaps to put it another way, is the science settled? And if it's not settled, why pursue all this like net zero at a breakneck speed if the science is uncertain? Which is a good point, and that's the one that we've consistently made for almost 20 years. The science is not settled, he says, in any meaningful sense. One must distinguish between the points on which there's general agreement among scientists and others, and the points about which there remains a wide range of views. Most experts agree that global surface temperatures have increased since 1880 by about 1 degree Celsius. They agree that humans are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and they agree that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases do have a warming effect on the planet. But there's broad disagreement about how much of the recent warming has been caused by humans, how much the planet will warm in the 21st century, whether that warming is dangerous, and how we should respond to the warming to improve human well-being. Because there's always a balance. In fact, I think John Kerry, who is the climate czar for the US, was recently asked about the Uyghur genocide going on in China. And, how does he balance that with his climate policy demands? And effectively, he dismissed the notion of human rights and kind of went for the climate policy over people. So, we have to be very careful about what we're trading off on climate policy, because the world is not all about climate change. We have many competing needs in society, particularly right now. One is healthcare. So how much money can we spend on one thing that's uncertain and far in the future versus something that's here and in the present? So this is something to consider. And there's even more controversy about the preferred nature and timing of the policy responses that should be made, and whether international agreements are likely to have a significant effect of aligning countries' policy approaches, given the differences in the interest between the OECD and non-OECD countries. And for those of you who maybe don't follow this closely, the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreement split the developed world and the developing world, the emerging nations, into two parts. So the developing world is supposed to pay $100 billion a year into a green climate fund to help the developing nations catch up. But, some of these concepts were developed like back in 1992 at the Rio conference. China then was literally a developing nation. Today, it's surging ahead, going to be taking over the US in short order as the superpower in the world. So do we really need to send them $100 billion a year from the West when they're already doing pretty good on their own? So Robert also mentions here Judith Curry, a prominent climate scientist, has said that the world has mischaracterized climate change as a tame problem with a simple solution. That would be, just reducing CO2. In fact, she says it's a wicked problem, meaning it's extremely complex with dimensions that are difficult to define, and they're changing with time. Further, it's a messy problem, meaning that it's characterized by resistance to change and contradictory or suboptimal solutions that create additional problems. And with that, we can see, for instance, with wind turbines. There's been vast development in wind turbines, but no development in recycling them. So wind turbine blades are being buried in landfills because there's no way to recycle them. Or solar panels. They are very difficult and very expensive to recycle, and they can't just be dumped in a landfill because they have toxic elements that leach from them. So, kind of cart before the horse there. And to make matters worse, the prediction models used by the Intergovernmental Panel are inadequate. There's heavy reliance on subjective judgment, and there's disagreement on desirable alternative outcomes. In the circumstances, those who claim that simple solutions should be urgently adopted risk creating a situation where the cure is not only ineffective, but worse than the disease. And again, I point to the UK. Just have a look at the press that's coming out of there. So anyway, those are comments from Robert Lyman. I just received them this afternoon. So I apologize that the intro is longer than it normally would be. But I think that those are very good points to consider, and some of them will be addressed as we go through the presentation tonight. So let's have a look at the presentation. As I said, it was inspired by Scott Adams Says. And he thought that business leaders have 6 questions on climate change. Let's see what they are. First of all, climate change is real. That's not the issue. Humans do contribute to climate change, as we just discussed. The question is, how much? How much is the ratio of natural influence to human influence? For instance, natural would be ocean currents, volcanoes. There's a big volcano going off right now in Las Palmas, another one in Guatemala. What are the influences of these versus human influence? Can we mitigate climate change? And if so, how? And how much will it cost? Because it's one thing to say, let's do a moonshot. Well, That was a very specific project. Addressing climate change in all the nations of the world is not. And very important here, are there opposing views? Are we hearing them? And if not, why not? So I put here 5 books that may be of interest to you. One is called Unsettled by Stephen Kunin, and I'll refer to a workshop that he moderated, which actually surprised him and woke him up to the fact that there are many irregularities and questions in the climate world. He's also going to be speaking in an online session with, I think it's with the National Post, if you want to get a ticket and hear him. Another one is False Alarm. This is by Bjorn Lomborg. He's a Danish economist. And I think exactly what Robert was trying to say is succinctly said here: how climate change panic costs us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet. That's really the essence of this. False Alarm, The Rise and Fall of the Carbon Dioxide Theory of Climate Change, is by Rex Fleming. He's an atmospheric scientist. And this False Alarm is written by Josta Peterson, who is a Swedish scientist. So Greta has a dissenter with very strong scientific credentials in her own backyard. Maybe she should listen to him. And of course, Apocalypse Never by Michael Schellenberger, who was a very strong environmental activist, and he just got tired of seeing his kids scared to death. So he started looking into things and finally decided, well, I think the things I've been promoting most of my life, many of them are not true. So here are the 6 questions on climate change. Can I believe the hockey stick graph of global warming? How accurate are climate model simulations 10, 20, and 100 years out? How valid are the 97% consensus claim on the science? Is my industry or business sector being greenwashed? Why are there red flags on the climate emergency? And who will benefit from carbon pricing, and who will be hurt by it? So first, let's have a look at the hockey stick. So the hockey stick goes back some time, but let's go back even further than the first hockey stick to the IPCC 1990 first assessment. You can clearly see here that prior to today, there was undulating kind of cyclical pattern of warming and cooling, and this was deemed to be the norm. But subsequently, a hockey stick graph was developed, which you can see here, that shows a flat stick and then a sudden blade of the hockey stick, a sudden rise of temperature, apparently in the present time. And just recently, in the new IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, in what's called the Summary for Policymakers, which is about a 42-page document versus the 4,000-page document of the science. So in that 42-page document, there's another hockey stick, a new one. But Steve McIntyre of Climate Audit, he's a former mining engineer and analyst. He found that he went back and he looked at all the data to make up this graph. And he found that the authors had kind of picked little bits and pieces from around the world and just excluded any temperature divergence, whether up or down. So anything that didn't fit the stick pattern, they left out, and they patched it all together and came up with this hockey stick. And I'll let you read his own observations on how this stick ended up being so high. But business people, of course, view hockey sticks' dramatic upticks on graph with suspicion, and rightly so, because they usually suggest that something's not quite right. So Enron's stock price, for instance, whoosh, boom. We all know what happened to Enron. and it left carnage everywhere. Of course, business and climate are not the same thing. Abrupt shifts in temperature do happen, and this happened naturally. This is in a period called the Younger Dryas. It was a period of rapid cooling in the late Pleistocene, 12,800 to 11,500 calendar years ago. It followed closely on the heels of a dramatically abrupt warming that brought the last ice age to a close. And it lasted for about 1,300 years and then ended, boom, abruptly as it started. But we still question these hockey stick graphs. And Investopedia has a short overview if you want to have a read of it. And we will post this PowerPoint on the web later on. And you can see here Groupon, for instance. Their revenues were fantastic, but so were their losses. So this is why people in business are a bit skeptical of hockey sticks. And if you'd like to read more about historical temperature data, this graph gives you a sense of different periods: warming and cooling, warming, cooling, warming, cooling, warming, cooling, warming, cooling, warming of today. And these two books are very good. They're very readable. They have some science in them, but it's usually in the sidebar, so it's not too complex for plain language readers. And very interesting because there's lots of human history in there. These are by Brian Fagan. He's a paleoclimatologist. So it's important that people understand that consensus is not science. This quote is from the National Academies Press in the US. It's from a small handbook called On Being a Scientist, Responsible Conduct in Research. And it says here, science has progressed through a uniquely productive marriage of human creativity and hard-nosed skepticism, of openness to new scientific contributions and persistent questioning of those contributions and the existing scientific consensus. So it is scientific to question. It's non-scientific to simply comply. And of course, there are some scientists who do agree with the certain findings or have been involved in certain research, and they would have a particular point of view. But that doesn't mean that scientists who come with a question and say, well, we don't agree with that, that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It means that, I think we lost part of the feed there. I'm just going to say that again. When scientists have a particular point of view or their research shows them some certain evidence and others agree with them, that's great. That's important. That's how science operates. But it also operates with other scientists who look at that research. Perhaps they have a different perspective. Perhaps they study a different discipline. And so they question the first work that was done. That is science, having consensus on one side and dissenters on the other, questioning what is the alleged consensus. So it's very important to recognize that this is integral to the scientific process. It's not something that's wrong or bad, and having a different point of view in science is literally how you develop science. So that's question one. How accurate are the climate model simulations 10, 20, and 100 years out? Now, climate model simulations are very complex mathematical models. So these are differential equations, and probably the best way to describe the dynamic action, shall we say, of this chaotic system is to think of your morning coffee in a glass mug. So you have your coffee or your tea in the morning. If you pour in cream, it doesn't just go in one direction. the next time you do that, look very closely at how it swirls around. And even if you stir it, you can see that it's swirling in different directions. This is the kind of very complex energy and motion that happens in the atmosphere. And these kinds of movements are extremely difficult to capture in a climate model. So if we look at the slide again, we'll just see what Professor Essex had to say. Because these are so complex, to do an accurate 10-year forecast, according to Professor Christopher Essex, one would need computing time equivalent to the age of the universe squared. That's for an accurate 10-year forecast. And that would exclude unknown things like volcanoes and asteroids and sudden changes in the magnetic field of the Earth, things that are far beyond our control. So in order to come up with climate models, they use certain shortcut algorithms that result in inaccurate short-term forecasts. Not one computer model predicted the about 18-year hiatus in warming from about 1998 to 2016. And this occurred despite a significant rise in carbon dioxide, and that's the gas that's said to cause global warming. So that makes one question the models. And even computer modelers themselves are pretty critical of their models. So Sayakuro Manabe said the climate model is a very good tool for understanding climate, but a very bad tool for predicting climate. A climate model gives a good model for the motion of the air in the atmosphere or the motion it can do. But all the things like trees and clouds and snow, all the fine details the models cannot do. Freeman Dyson, also of Princeton. And here we have Hans von Storch of the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And he says that so far, no one has been able to provide a compelling answer to why climate change seems to be taking a break, in that he's referring to the hiatus of about 18 years that I just mentioned. We're facing a puzzle. Recent carbon dioxide emissions have actually risen even more steeply than we feared. And as a result, according to most climate models, we should have seen temperatures rise by about 0.25 degrees Celsius or 0.45 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 10 years. This interview was in 2013. That hasn't happened. In fact, the increase over the past 15 years was just 0.06 degrees Celsius or 0.11 degrees Fahrenheit, a value very close to zero. Now, what shocked Kunin? He was working with the American Physical Society, and they decided to do a workshop. So in the workshop, there were about 6 scientists, and you could say that 3 of them were sort of anthropogenic global warming advocates, and 3 of them were rather more skeptical. They agreed that there's anthropogenic global warming, but they didn't see it as catastrophic, and they had many questions about the models and evidence. So what puzzled him, he also, going into those sessions, thought, well, climate science is very well developed, and obviously there are no questions here. But he was quite shocked to find out that that's not quite the case. And this excerpt is from the transcript, although it has been written about by another person. So he's talking about general circulation models, and projections derived from general circulation models, these are climate models, are used to tell policymakers when greenhouse gas emissions must peak and by how much they must fall to avoid temperatures rising more than the 2 degrees Celsius increase above pre-industrial levels, that would be about 1860, which is stipulated in the Paris Climate Treaty. So Steve Kunin, chairing the APS workshop, that's the American Physical Society, read an extract from Chapter 10 of the IPCC's 5th assessment report. So that's the big report prior to this recent one. Simulated responses to forcings, including greenhouse gas forcings, can be scaled up or out a century. And Dr. Collins said, yes, and one of the reasons we're not doing that is that we're not using the models as a statistical projection tool. And Dr. Kunin, what are you using them as? Dr. Collins, well, we took exactly the same models that got the forcing wrong and which got sort of the projections wrong up to 2100. And Dr. Kunin says, so why do we even show centennial scale projections? And Dr. Collins says, well, I mean, it is part of the IPCC assessment process. It's part of the assessment process is not a scientific justification for using assumptions that are known to be empirically wrong to produce projections that help drive the political narrative of a planet spinning toward a climate catastrophe. So just imagine in your place of work, if you did that kind of thing, if your boss said, what are the projections for the next 2 months in our sales? And you did them, and then you went, oh, gee, I'm sorry, there's a 30% error in that. I projected a bit too high. He's like, okay, we'll fix it. So you fix it. And then he says, oh, and by the way, can you do like a general 10-year projection so we can put it in our business plan? And so you go back and use the original formula that was 30% too high, and you do that for 10 years. Imagine how long you'd keep your job. Not very long, I don't think. Anyhow, so let's go on with the presentation. So effectively, Judith Curry, who was one of the people in that session, and also one of the people Robert Lyman cited in his work in the beginning that I read to you, she said after the AR5 report, which is the IPCC report that came out about 6 years ago, she said that carbon dioxide is not the control knob. It's not the control knob that can fine-tune climate. So this is when they found the hiatus, and this hiatus, sort of a lapse in warming or a pause in warming, began before Kyoto was ratified. That was the original forebearer of the Paris Agreement. So in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the AR5 report, excerpt above, stating that despite a dramatic rise in CO2, and you can see that here in this graph, very dramatic rise, there had been a hiatus in global warming for 15 years prior. And you can see that here in this flat line. Dr. Judith Curry, in testimony to the US Senate, stated that carbon dioxide is not the control knob that can fine-tune climate. Doesn't mean it has no effect, it just means it's not the substance that causes warming. And so a carbon tax will not stop climate change or reduce extreme weather events. And this is quite an interesting article in the Financial Post. Insurance companies like to make claims that global warming is causing extreme weather events like wildfires and flood, and that's simply not true. It's shown with evidence by Robert Muir, who's a professional engineer, and he talks a lot about urban flooding and how urban flooding is an outcome of poor drainage and paving over wetlands within a city, where there used to be natural runoff and natural catchments, and now they're somebody's parking lot or house. And also climate policy expert and author Roger Pielke Jr., he has a very good book on disasters and climate change. And really, if people don't build on the floodplain like Calgary did, then you won't ever have a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe. Now, that is, without being mean about it, a bad pun, that is water under the bridge. It's built. But we shouldn't blame climate change for it. We shouldn't put up wind farms to try and stop it. We should deal with flooding issues. So the next topic is, how valid are the 97% consensus claims on science? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, scientists agree that climate changes all the time, and we can see that. We saw that before. They generally agree that human activity contributes to it. They disagree about the ratio of human to natural influence. And you can see that here, like what's the difference in warming between the medieval warm period or Roman optimum and today? Like it looks like it was warmer in the past. So this was all natural. Can all of this be human? Scientists disagree about whether humans can control climate. That's a very important point. And economists disagree about cost-effective efforts to address climate change. Engineers dispute the effectiveness of proposed climate solutions like wind and solar, as they're expensive, unreliable, intermittent forms of power generation, and they're unsuited to society's needs today. So business people know that social proofs are influential, and a social proof is a bandwagoning technique, and that is exactly what the 97% consensus is. Now, we ran this ad in the Calgary Herald in 2014, and boy, did the climate activist community go berserk over it. We said 97% consensus on global warming. No consensus, not even close. They're fooling you. And I'll show you why. We did this report, and it's still on our website. So, have a look if you're interested in the numbers. Once you look into these 97% consensus reports and you drill down, you find out that it's really just a bunch of social proofs. And a social proof was developed probably as business psychology in the most influential book by Robert Cialdini on influence. So that's what fads are. Fads are when people go, jump on the bandwagon, go, oh yeah, we all want to wear Uggs, we all want to wear Lululemon, we all want to, buy Starbucks, we all want to. So, those companies are very effective in their marketing campaigns. But the principle behind it is this 97% consensus social proof. So let's look at some of the flawed surveys. In Al Gore's documentary, he said 0 scientists disagreed with anthropogenic global warming. But Benny Peiser reran Oresky's research and showed that only 13 scientists explicitly agreed, and most of them had no position whatsoever. Pretty surprising. Then there's another very popular one that was done by Doran and Zimmerman. This is Zimmerman's original MA thesis. You can get it on Lulu, which is an online publisher. And she writes about her own research. I can honestly say that I've heard very convincing arguments from all the different sides, and I think I'm actually more neutral on the issue now than I was before I started this project. So that's pretty interesting. The 97% did not convince her. And interestingly enough, when did these consensus studies start appearing? Now, this is rather a complex image here. In the background, we have Christie and Spencer Graf from the University of Alabama, Huntsville. And they show all of these models. And these little tiny things here are referring to each of the lines of these models. And then they compare it to weather balloon and the satellite data sets that they themselves gather. So Christie and Spencer do the satellite data sets out of the University of Alabama, Huntsville. And you can see the models continue to go up and up and up and up, projecting very high. And the satellite data sets, which are the squares, are pretty flatlined. And the circles are there as a means of comparing the satellite data and making sure that it's accurate. Those come from weather balloons. So you can see that they're pretty much on a par. And what started happening as there was this divergence between the models and the measured temperatures, or the data sets from satellites and weather balloons, boom, we started having a lot of consensus surveys. So we had Areskes in 2004, 2007, Doran and Zimmerman, André et al., 2010, Lewandowski 2013, Cook et al. 2013, and there's a couple more. But you can see the temperatures are actually pretty much flatlining, and the models are just going way, way up. So it seems like someone's desperately trying to convince the world that there is a consensus when it seems to be falling apart based on evidence. Question: is my industry or business sector being greenwashed? Well, shouldn't climate policy advocates have to meet the same standards as you and your business? This is what the Competition Bureau demands of businesses. Before making environmental claims, they must make sure that their claims are not misleading or likely to result in misinterpretation, that they are accurate and specific. Claims that broadly imply that a product is environmentally beneficial or benign must be accompanied by a statement that provides support, that they are substantiated and verifiable. Claims must be tested, and all tests must be scientifically sound, conducted in good faith, and documented, that they are relevant. Claims must be specific to a particular product and used only in an appropriate context. Claims must also take into consideration all relevant aspects of the product's whole life cycle. So, when you think about what I said about wind turbine blades being buried, that doesn't seem very environmentally friendly, does it? And one should not imply that a product is endorsed by a third-party organization when it is not. So those are some considerations that we should apply to climate activists. So the fact is, yes, you are being greenwashed. And of course, we've been told that Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. But it's funny because Iceland is also warming faster than the rest of the world. So is Japan, faster than the global average. So the Himalayas, the US West, Australia, Russia, Northern Canada, now 3 times the global average. West Antarctica, 3 times faster than the global average. Australia, Spain, and the mountains also twice as fast. So it's mathematically impossible that every place in the world is warming faster than the average. But these are the headlines that buzz around the world. And there's a thing called the flaw of averages. So let's look at this graph here. Models done based on these 4 scenarios. The most catastrophic and the least likely scenario is called RCP 8.5. And that's the one that most climate scholars like, but it's the least likely. What is more likely is this, but this is less published. So Canadian climate modelers love the RCP 8.5. The public generally have no idea that the RCP 8.5 is the worst case, least likely scenario, and that such averaging renders these useless for policymaking. So here we have from the Prairie Climate Atlas, from the Prairie Climate Center, scenario RCP 8.5, high carbon. Where? Winnipeg. Future period 2051 to 2080. I wonder if they were using that 30% factor that Steve Kunin picked out. Anyhow, you can see that there might be an increase in average annual temperature of, it could be plus 2.6 degrees Celsius or perhaps 4.4 degrees Celsius. And you might have 13 more days that are over 30 degrees Celsius, or you might have 33. So, these Hot findings are often averaged to arrive at completely useless numbers. They're frightening to politicians and the public and policymakers. But, as we discussed before, this is least likely and most cited. It should not be used at all. Bjorn Lomborg has found that if all countries met their Paris Agreement targets, there would be virtually no reduction in global warming. No reduction in global warming. So is it worth trillions of dollars per year if they just did the Paris Agreement to come up with perhaps 0.05 degrees Celsius? That's 5/100ths of a degree, or 17/100ths of a degree if the Paris Agreement was extended for 17 years, 70 years. Does that sound reasonable to spend trillions of dollars? These are not even measurable temperatures for the average person, for any person. It's important to know that the 2 degrees Celsius target was arbitrarily set by an economist 40 years ago. So that was before we knew a lot of what we know now about climate change. And this is Ted Nordhaus writing in Foreign Affairs, saying that his uncle, the Yale University economist William Nordhaus, proposed this 2-degree target. And the standard was, by his own admission, arbitrary. So that article is called Why the 2 Degree C Target is a Delusion. Very interesting. Now, sadly, in Canada, conflicts of interest abound in Canadian carbon pricing policy pushers, like the Eco-Fiscal Commission, which is now the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And Parker Gallant has done a series of blog posts. Parker is a former international banker, and he's done a series of blog posts on the conflict of interests and abuse of tax subsidized charities and foundations, the partisan narrative to advocate for carbon price laws. It's astounding. When you read it, it's really astounding. This organization claims to be nonpartisan. They receive $21 million from the federal government, and there's not a dissenting view on the panel. Carbon pricing is ineffective in emissions reduction. And how do we know that? Because greenhouse gas emissions in Norway, it never worked there. They had a very stringent carbon tax in the 1990s, but carbon taxes contributed only a 2% reduction. So they found it was better to actually have industry work closely with government and incrementally, figure out ways to reduce emissions. Canada has more than 600 GHG reduction regulations, efficiency incentives, and these are effectively carbon tax equivalents. And yet our emissions have been stable for the past 40 years. Robert Lyman wrote this report. He's also written a number of commentaries on the fact that no one's ever actually audited all of the costs that are being thrown at climate initiatives or their effectiveness. So literally billions of dollars are being thrown at climate initiatives every year, and we have no idea whether or not they're doing anything constructive, but we do know our emissions have not gone down. On the other hand, something very important to remember, let me just point this out to you. It's important to remember that although we have not met targets in the past 30 years, our emissions have effectively flatlined during a time when we had an increase in population of 7%. So no one talks about that, and they have a bit of a breakup here. Sorry about that, lost the line feed there. So anyway, we haven't met our targets, but emissions have flatlined. And we had a 37% increase in population over the past 30 years. And every person who comes here, most of the people who come here come from China, India, the Philippines. Those are the top countries right now for immigration. And those countries are warm. So when people come here, they need far more energy, So of course they're going to increase their emissions use. And yet somehow that doesn't appear in our emissions. We haven't seen emissions going up dramatically, 37%. So we must be doing some things right. Now you can see how ludicrous these targets are based on past efforts. And if we accept that what we've just heard, that carbon dioxide is not deemed to be a significant driver of global warming anymore, then a carbon tax is unnecessary, and it is a huge impediment to the Canadian economy. And these environmental groups have succeeded in making voluntary Paris emission targets into law. That's Bill C-12. That will destroy Canada. Now, why are there red flags on the climate emergency? Let's look at that. This is from the Alberta Securities Commission, and you can see the red flags of investing fraud. And as I read through just the headlines here, just think about the parallels in climate dogma. Won't cost us very much. We'll actually make more money, and we'll maybe even cash in with $26 trillion market. Offshore investment, tax-free. Yes, going green. I think the LEAP manifesto promoted a society where we'd all be caring and sharing. But sharing what? It's a great investment opportunity. Your friends can't be wrong. Well, this is the bandwagoning technique. And also, if anyone has a dissenting view, of course, they're called a denier. There's no actual discussion about the pros and cons. Insider tips, profit like the experts. So we hear that a lot in the clean tech world, get in now, get ahead of the game. We want Canada to be a leader in clean tech. And in fact, there's no energy transition going on. Don't miss this opportunity. Get in now. Well, we've been throwing billions of dollars at wind and solar for the past 40 years, and it provides 6% of the energy in the US and 3.5% in Canada. So maybe that's not such a great business investment. The Competition Bureau tells us that we should protect our business from fraud. And unfortunately, most presentations in the climate carbon pricing world exhibit strong similarities to characteristics associated with scammers and fraud. They pretend to be someone the business would trust. Like there are these ENGO proxies pushing climate and carbon policies using names like Institute, Commission, Smart, Green. They create a sense of urgency, climate crisis. They fly under the radar, slipping through normal business processes undetected. So many of these organizations are operated as federally registered charities. They are thus crowned with the halo of doing good, yet they are technically forbidden to engage in partisan activities to change any law, well, until very recently. So you and your business are financially subsidizing them while they foist on you damaging and ineffective policies. And they use intimidation and fear. Don't you care about your children? We only have 12 years left. You only care about money, you greedy profiteer. So these are like really bullying tactics. And they entice business representatives with promises of amazing deals, like the $30 trillion opportunity in the climate crisis. That's a hockey stick, an economic hockey stick, because that most businesses don't make $30 trillion overnight. So let's look again at the Competition Bureau, which advises that we recognize, reject, and report fraud. Social engineering plays a huge role in how scammers perpetrate fraud. It's all about manipulating people into revealing confidential or personal information or taking actions that lead them to being victimized by fraud. So see the parallels to climate and carbon price policy advocates. Social engineering relies heavily on individuals being persuaded based on feelings of reciprocity, returning a favor. We must do our part and be a climate leader. Commitment and consistency. We must honor prior commitments, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris Agreement. I mean, how many times in business have you had to sometimes walk away from an agreement just because it turned out it would be bad for you? Sometimes you have to do that. Or social proof, following what others do. Every country signed Paris Agreement, therefore we have to. Authority, obeying authority figures. 97% consensus of scientists. The science is settled. Liking, being persuaded by someone who is liked. So they use celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio, or they use naming and shaming you as a denier. And scarcity, the perceived shortage generates demand. The world will not have enough food or resources to support growing population. Things are dire. But if you read the book Factfulness by Hans Rosling, he shows that this is false. So it's important to be aware of these very common human tendencies that fraudsters exploit to achieve their ends. And this seems to be extortion. Firms ignoring the climate crisis will go bankrupt, says Mark Carney. Bank of England has warned. Mark Carney's 2015 presentation to Lloyd's of London on the climate crisis has been shown to be a failure of analysis by analyst Steve Kopitz. Carney spent 13 years with Goldman Sachs. Is he objective? Because they just bought these carbon offset companies and they're cashing in on the carbon markets. So who will benefit from carbon pricing and who will be hurt by it? Well, who will benefit? Who will be hurt by it? Transnational firms, hedge funds, Wall Street, and banks may benefit. This is an example from 2007. This is a buyer, a private fund in the World Bank, resold certified emissions reduction credits, and they raised $1.2 billion in 23 minutes on the pollution of a Chinese plant. Now, this program has changed somewhat, but it just gives you an idea that there's this whole carbon trading practice going on in the background, unobserved by most ordinary citizens or business people, where big transnational businesses can cash in, but you can't. You will be hurt by carbon pricing. You will pay. So small, medium-sized, and large domestic corporations and consumers will bear the brunt of carbon taxes, as all goods and services will have compound carbon taxes added on. Canada is a vast, cold, sparsely populated country where there are few efficiencies of volume, and many materials and supplies must be imported, raw materials or manufactured goods exported. So Canadian firms will not be competitive. And Canadian fuel taxes alone already amounted to 192 per ton carbon tax equivalent before April the 1st, 2020. So it's now well over that. But in the world, the average global carbon price is $8 a ton. In China, it's $2 a ton. In the US, it's $0 a ton. And in Canada today, it's $40 a ton. So that already looks pretty bleak for us. Now, something that people are not aware of, perhaps. Canada made a climate deal with France to push carbon neutrality. And France, this was during the time of Trump, of course, has threatened the US, Canada's largest trading partner. So France told Trump, no Paris Agreement, no EU trade agreement. And this is our agreement with France, if you want to read about it. And you may not know of the additional French influence in Canadian lives, but Canada is part of La Francophonie, which is a huge UN voting bloc. You can see it here all marked in purple. So there's 54 states and government members. There's 7 member state associates and some observers, 27 observers. So you can imagine when the Paris Agreement confab offers $100 billion a year fund to be paid by developed nations to the developing ones, countries with some of the highest gross domestic product in the world, like China, 11.8 trillion in 2017, India, 2.5 trillion, Brazil, 2.1 trillion, Korea, 1.5 trillion, Indonesia, 1 trillion. They do not contribute to the Green Climate Fund, but they also qualify as recipients. And the countries with some of the highest per capita incomes, such as Singapore, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, do not contribute. But Greece, a country wallowing in debt, is required to pay. So these countries could also apply as developing nations. So there are no reporting or accountability requirements with this $100 billion a year fund that's supposed to come from Western nations. So carbon pricing will destroy Canada's oil and gas industries. Meanwhile, France imports oil and gas from despot nations, which are competitors to Canadian product. So it's kind of curious that we made that deal with France. But France also has this 2 degrees Celsius law on investment. In trade of services, France was Canada's 4th largest global partner, 2nd largest in Europe in 2018. And bilateral trade stabilized at 6.7 billion. We are a net importer of French services, 46 million. But you maybe didn't know there's 250 French subsidiaries of Canadian companies employing about 25,000 people, and they're spread across the French territory. Major companies are present, and some of these are familiar: Bombardier, Boralex, CGI, Intergex, Magna, McCain, Mittal, Astra, OpenText, Vermilion. Many of these are leaders in their sector. Canada, as a country of immediate destination for Canadian direct investment, is the 6th European destination and 20th worldwide. So that all sounds like, well, maybe it's worth it to go along with them on this 2-degree law. But in fact, Canada-US trade facts are pretty surprising, because the trade value is 100 times greater than that with France. While all trade partners are important, clearly crucial evidence is being ignored to favor certain Canada-France-based industries. So carbon and climate policies are ineffective and disastrous. Carbon pricing is another version of an old, frequently failed idea. They were analyzed and rejected by Natural Resources Canada in the early 1990s. The announced goal of Canadian climate policy is to reduce national emissions by 30% from 2010 by 2030, and then go on reducing them to perhaps 50% from 2010 to 2050. I think the targets are actually more stringent now. Emissions reductions of that magnitude will not be achieved at low or moderate carbon tax levels. Taxes would need to be high enough to shut down entire industries. Shut down industries, like shut down cement, manufacturing, steel manufacturing, some agriculture. So it will cost families. So a carbon rebate or dividend is offered to ease the financial pain. But this is just a case of bait and switch. By including a consumer rebate to a carbon tax measure, the government is trying to argue that it's achieving a social justice objective. If this were such a great idea, why has it not used the same approach with sales taxes or corporate income taxes, like to raise the tax and then rebate the money to consumers? Or better yet, just lower everyone's income taxes. Think that'll happen? So carbon and climate policies are ineffective and disastrous. Target groups, oil, natural gas, and coal producers and consumers, will be worse off by far. That is the whole point of the tax. They want to make it unbearable to use these products. But given the high degree of economic integration between Canada and the US, it's abundantly clear that the competitiveness of Canadian firms and their ability to attract investment in the future will suffer. Now, it may be that the US will institute a carbon tax. I kind of doubt it, but certainly if our carbon tax is $40 a ton and theirs is none, or ours is $170 a ton, that's going to cripple this country. The magnitude of the emissions reductions sought by 2030 and beyond are much, much higher than can be accomplished by efficiency improvements. So you can't just insulate your firm and call it a day. You can't just buy a few EVs and that will fix things. That's not going to do it. The effect will be to shut down whole segments of the economy, especially in resource-intensive regions. So the bottom line is that there's no need for Canada to reduce its emissions to the point at which it severely harms Canadians' economy and standard of living, because indeed present climate policies, with their dire implications for Western Canada, pose a threat to national unity far more serious than anything that has occurred since the debates over Quebec's secession in the 1980s and 90s. Those considerations surely outweigh the benefits of making symbolic gestures that will have no real effect on global emissions or climate trends. So there we've covered these points. Let's just look for a minute at some geopolitics. Canada is competing in the Oil Olympics. Here are the world's biggest oil producers. Which of these do you think will stop producing oil? We've got the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Canada, Iran, Iraq, UAE, China, Kuwait, and Brazil. I don't think any of them will stop. Many of them are emerging nations. These would all qualify as emerging nations who could access the Global Green Climate Fund. These countries could access the Green Climate Fund, and US and Canada would have to pay into it. We're a competitor in the world. And this is from the CBC co-production, The Tipping Point, Age of the Oil Sands from 2011. Don Thompson was then president of the Oil Sands Developer Group. And he talks about the 2008 recession. And he said, even in the heart of the recession, the oil sands was spinning something on the order of 20 billion into the Canadian economy. At that level, you will have employment in Canada dependent on the order of about 450,000 people. The oil sands are key to the Canadian economy. And I mean, really, look at this. We're a global provider of oil, and we're population-wise a very tiny country competing with these other countries like the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. It's important to know that climate policies have led to the fact that more than 100 billion in investment walked away in 2 years. This is one of Robert Lyman's PowerPoints, and he details it. $100 billion. So really what we have to do to save Canada, we have to quit the Paris Agreement and build pipelines and get our economy back on track. We have a new event coming up. It's our 18th annual climate science event, and we have 2 guest speakers. Normally we'd have this at the Red and White Club in Calgary, but due to COVID, we've gone online. So our first speaker will be Dr. Ruud Burkhout, president of Clintel. Clintel is a group of more than 900 scientists and scholars who affirm that the climate emergency is over, and we do have time to work out these problems. We don't have to rush into net zero. Dr. Burkhout's presentation will be Climate Science, Let the Data Speak. That will be on October the 2nd at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And he will be answering live Q&A after the presentation. So please tune in, I'll be hosting. And then we have Mark Morano. He's quite the character. He's the author of a recent book called Green Fraud, and he will be talking about some of his adventures in the climate world and also the Green New Deal, the Great Regret. That will be on October the 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And again, we'll have live Q&A, and I'll be hosting that as well. So this is our motto, climate, change your mind. Is it you? Is it really CO2? Thank you all for watching, and I hope that if you like our work, that perhaps you would donate or become a member. Unlike the big environmental groups, we're a small member-funded organization. We're a nonprofit. We have a volunteer board, and we operate on about $150,000 a year. So every penny counts to us, and we make every penny squeak. We do a lot of things ourselves. And we'd love to have you as a member, because then you get our bi-monthly mailouts, which is CLI-SCI, a roundup of recent climate science papers. And the other one is Extracts, which is climate and energy news from around the world, IPCC news, things that you probably wouldn't see in your daily paper. And you get our newsletters 4 times a year. You get press releases if you want them. You can unsubscribe if you don't. And our reports and our videos. So we really would love to have more members. And someone pointed out on YouTube the other day that we now have more than 40,000 subscribers to YouTube. And if everybody just chipped in 10 or 15, like, we'd have $500,000 to operate on. That would be fantastic. Now, just to put that in context, some of the big ENGOs have like $19 million in assets. They're charities. They're funded by you, the taxpayer, whether you like what they do or not. So the great thing with us, we're only funded by people who like what we do, or who are interested in the fact that we advocate for open civil debate and full cost-benefit analysis of climate policies. That's our mandate. And we do that for you. We're not speaking on behalf of industry. We're doing this for you, the consumer, the citizen. These are very complex topics to understand, and people, as I showed you, are just getting snowed. They're getting greenwashed by all these claims that, we're saving the planet, when most of these plans have not even really been thought through. They're very ideological, and perhaps one day we'll be able to do these things, like reach net zero, but not in the next 10 or 20, 30 years. It's impossible. So now, if people have some questions, I'm just going to check here on my other monitor and just see if we've got any questions coming in. We'd be happy to answer them. Let me just have a look. Here we go. Okay, we have one question. Is there any scientific solution to the world's dependency on plastics, or dependency on oil, for instance, on plastics or fusion? Well, every solution comes with other impacts. For instance, people often say, well, why don't we use hemp or corn to make plastics? And that can be done and is done in some applications. Some of your biodegradable shopping plastic bags are probably made from that. But the difficulty is that those are good for limited applications. They're probably not appropriate for, say, sterile hospital applications, where you want that single-use plastic device. And you want it to be of an extremely high standard. You don't want it to biodegrade, especially not in the middle of some kind of surgical operation. Again, I'm not an expert in the plastics field, so I'm not going to speak on their behalf here. But the problem with, say, using some kind of a biocrop. I think I just lost the line there. One problem with using some kind of a biocrop to create plastics is then you're taking away food from agriculture. And in the United States, there's been a really negative effect of corn ethanol. It's moved about 6 megatons of corn off world markets. And what that has meant is that there's been a rise in civil unrest worldwide because food prices have gone up, because corn is a staple in most poor countries. And it's also a staple for cattle feed. So, one big climate policy in the United States has actually had a global impact on humans, causing parts of the refugee crisis. And this might sound ridiculous, but you can look at the research work done by the New England Complex Institute, Complex Systems Institute, NECSI it's called, NECSI. And they could actually track where the next civil unrest would be in the world based on food prices related to this particular initiative. So, if you're going to grow plastics, then you're not going to grow food there, which is very similar to if you're going to plant trees, then you have to forego that land for agriculture. So sometimes the solution will cause an equal or greater problem. Regarding fusion, I'm not an expert in that area. I know there's a lot of work going on in small modular reactors. There's some potential, but I think it's something that has to enter the market gradually. And if you look at the work of Václav Smil, who is an expert on energy, you can read quite a bit about different energy forms. But his historical view is that it takes between 70 to 100 years for that transition or inclusion of a new type of technology or solution. It's not done overnight. So, we went from wood to coal to natural gas to nuclear. And all along the way, these others were not totally abandoned. And all of them were an improvement on the predecessor. So actually, wind and solar were the first forms of energy that humans used as a kinetic form of capture, and we gave them up for wood, coal, and natural gas and nuclear. So we're kind of going backwards. Of course, also you should remember that any kind of equipment like this is made today from oil, natural gas, and coal, either the energy from it or the byproducts of it. So a lot of times when people say, well, let's build more wind and solar, because obviously it's clean, they don't know that it's all made from oil, gas, and coal. So you will simply increase the use of oil, gas, and coal. Plus, it has to be backed up when it's on the grid by probably natural gas. And again, I encourage you to read about the catastrophe unfolding in the UK right now, because they don't have enough natural gas to back up the huge wind farms that they've built out. So, I'm also happy to offer some links to whatever information I do have on this if you want to email me at media@friendsofscience.org, and I'll dig up the links and send them. I can also post them online with this video and the PowerPoint. Here's another question. If Canada was entirely self-sufficient, would we have enough left over to fund our social agendas? I'm not sure how you mean that, self-sufficient. Part of the process of selling our resources overseas is that this is how we earn money and create jobs. So we could kind of have a closed system, I suppose, regarding our own energy use and our own agriculture. But, we'd certainly, I would think that we would be able to survive, perhaps even reasonably well, but we wouldn't have any kind of spare money, and we are part of a global economy. So I'm probably not the best person to comment more on that. We could maybe ask Robert Lyman more about that, and maybe he'll write something up on it if someone wants to send in more of a question about that. But when you're part of a global economy, there are things that we need from other countries, and we either trade with them on things that they need, or we just buy it from them. But to do that, we have to have money from something that we sold to someone else, somewhere else. I'll just check and see if there's any more questions. Mm-hmm. No, okay. Okay, that looks like the questions, all the questions that we have for this evening. So as I said, if you have other questions, you can also email us. You can also interact with us on Twitter, on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Our YouTube page is always active, our blog, our website. We'd be happy to hear from you, and we look forward to presenting more of these live streams and hope that you'll join us for our upcoming event, October the 2nd at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, for Dr. Guus Burkhout, of Clintel, and October the 6th for Mark Morano at 7 p.m. So for Friends of Science Society, thanks very much for joining us. I'm Michelle Stirling. Good night.